Here we go. What I'm trying to do is get your help with formulating a couple of those external messages. And I'll start with a couple of dimensions of the problem. Who has seen this picture before? Anybody? What it does depict is mammals on Earth by weight, and each little box is 1 million tons. So there's roughly 400 million tons of humans on Earth. But there's about twice as much cows, which is really domestic animals. And we don't keep those cows as pets. They are our protein stack. They're hamburgers. And of course there's other domestic animals as well, dogs, pigs, etc. The wild animals on Earth are the little green dots here. Elephants is 1 million tons. That's one dimension of the problem we're facing. The other dimension is who eats all those hamburgers. And it's us. We, the top richest people on Earth, consume almost half of what there is to consume. And we emit roughly half of the greenhouse gases there is. So we are the problem. So what do we do about this? And I've enrolled, first this picture. You've probably seen the hockey stick. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And of course forests. The other curve is forests. Forests is what we expect to save us. Forests are the carbon sinks of the Earth. And while we're busily trying to increase the carbon content in the atmosphere, we're also decreasing the number of trees that can help us here.
Carbon capture.
Yeah, so we're in a serious problem. And this speaker is Kate Rayworth. I don't know how many have seen her, but she helped us with this presentation that I'm trying to run now.
Hi, I'm delighted to join you and contribute to this conversation about climate change and economic growth. Here's what I want to say. I want to talk about the aeroplane economy and the skateboard economy, because I think it's time for a shift in the way we think about our economies and GDP growth. We've lived through several hundred years where global GDP growth has been rising very steeply, as we can see, and in many countries it is urgently needed to meet the needs of the most deprived people. But this global path of GDP growth has been both divisive, with the returns of growth going to the richest 1%. In 2017, 83% of global GDP went to just the top 1% worldwide. And GDP growth has also been incredibly degenerative. It's running down the living world on which we all deeply depend, causing climate change and catastrophic biodiversity loss. So our politicians know this, which is why when they call for growth, because this has become the target of policy making, they call for green growth or clean growth, smart, resilient, inclusive, balanced growth, any kind of growth you want, so long as you want growth. I think we need a new compass, and I call it the donut. The hole in the middle is a place where people are falling short on life's essentials, so we want to ensure that no one is left in the middle here. No one is falling short on health or education, housing, food, energy, political voice. We want to get everybody out of that hole, and yet we cannot overshoot the outer ring of this donut, because there we put so much pressure on our planet's living systems we begin to keep them out of balance. And these are the 9 planetary boundaries drawn up by Johan Rockström and other leading Earth system scientists. So the 21st century challenge is to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And today, on a global scale, we are far from both of these. Many millions of people fall short on life's essentials, those red wedges going into the middle. We want to eliminate them. And we've already overshot at least 4 planetary boundaries, not only on climate change, also on land conversion, on biodiversity loss, on excessive nitrogen use. So we need to come into balance from both sides at the same time. Economists and policymakers of the last century did not see this picture. Why would we expect their theories and policies to be up for taking on its challenge. We need our own approach to growth and rethinking what prosperity looks like. I believe we need to put two design principles at the heart of global prosperity. First, we need economies that are regenerative by design, that work with and within the cycles of the living world, within planetary boundaries. But also they need to be distributive by design, so that the value that's created is shared far more equitably with all who help to create it. So I believe 21st century economies need to aim not for endless growth, but for regenerative and distributive design. Now the dream of policymakers is this, what they would call inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Can it be achieved? I use this diagram, which I drew, because I believe we need to be able to talk more clearly about the challenges of decoupling. So you can see GDP growing in this scenario, but we've got three different stories of resource use. The first is relative decoupling, where resource use keeps growing, but less quickly than GDP. That, of course, is by no means adequate in today's high-income countries. Then you've got absolute decoupling, where GDP keeps growing, but resource use, whether it's carbon emissions, or water, or land footprint, or material use, that falls absolutely. Now, some countries have shown that over the past 20 or so years, they have achieved this. Their GDP has risen, and their use of resources, even on a global consumption basis, has fallen when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. Germany, Sweden, and others have shown this. But look at the bottom line. It's sufficient absolute decoupling. That's what we need. We need a decoupling of resource use from carbon emissions to material footprints that bring us back within planetary boundaries. And I think Kevin Anderson's work is very powerful here, showing that it's not happening on anything like the speed or scale that's required to bring us back within planetary boundaries. So there's no evidence of GDP being decoupled from resource use on the speed or scale that is required to be compatible with coming back within planetary boundaries. As a result, we have economies that need to grow, whether or not this makes us thrive. I think of it as the airplane economy, an airplane that is unlike any other because it can never be allowed to land, must always keep flying off into the sunset of growth. We're addicted to unending growth because it's been structured into our institutions. It's financially structured into institutions because financial markets pursue the maximum rate of return on financial investment because banks create money as debt-bearing interest. These both drive unending growth. We are politically addicted because no leader wants to lose their place in this G20 family photo, but if their economy stops growing, they'll be booted out by the next emerging powerhouse. And we're socially addicted because after a century of consumerist propaganda, we've been convinced that we improve ourselves by buying something more. I don't think these addictions are insurmountable, but they deserve far more attention than they get. Because let's step back. Our economies may be designed to grow forever, but when it comes to nature, nothing in nature grows forever. Nature grows until it's grown up, and then it comes to thrive, from your children's feet to an elephant to the Amazon forest. If nature tries to grow forever, it destroys the living system on which it depends. Why would we expect that our economies could be the one system that bucks this trend? So I believe we need to let go of the airplane metaphor and move to a skateboard economy, an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it grows. Because you see, a skateboarder goes up and down, adapting to the landscape ahead. We need incredible transitions to create regenerative circular economies that run on sunlight, that use resources again and again. We need to transition to economies that distribute value far more equitably. They may be modular, open source, certainly circular and distributive of their industries. I think GDP needs to be able to be a response variable that moves up and down as we make these investments, rather than being always required to move up. But of course that means we have to go far beyond merely changing the indicator of GDP, because we can't forget we are politically, financially and socially structured into expecting, depending upon and demanding unending growth. So if we really want to free our economies from this growth addiction, we need to transform the structure in politics and finance and in society to free us so that we can have economies that make us thrive, whether or not they grow. I hope that throws in plenty of food for thought to your discussions. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi,
Sorry.
I'm delighted to join you
Now be quiet.
Did she make that for us?
No, she made it for something called the Climate Parliament in Stockholm a couple of weeks back. So back to us, the 10%. What is it that makes us continue on this ever-increasing expectations of ever-increasing standard? Well, since the war, we've basically had a very good time, and we've been, for generations now, made to think that it's going to continue like this forever. The problem is, of course, that that doesn't happen. And what the reality is, no, here again. Sorry, I'm not friends with this. There we go. The reality is that many people actually have stopped growing, or their pay has stopped growing. So what do people do instead? Well, the banks offer loans. So people go into debt in order to keep their standard of living increasing. And what we have as an effect of that is, of course, that we pay more and more interest. So the interest we pay to banks and to others is increasing. But still, the remaining surface or area underneath that curve and above this curve is what decides our consumption, and it keeps growing. So for us, the 10% debt is very, very well connected to climate change. So what do we do with all that money? Well, if you get more money, you can do two things. You can spend it, or you can invest. If you look at investments, what we do with investments is we buy larger houses, or we buy assets, financial assets like shares or something. Now both of those, if we buy a house, we buy it from somebody. That person gets a lot of money, so it might actually increase consumption even as assets. But most of the consumption is other things. We consume lifestyle stuff like a larger car or new kitchen or travels or whatever. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in, we spend more and more money on our kids' education for some reason. It's consumption in my view, because there is free education as well, but for some reason we'd like to pay for our children to be better off. Now, what happens now is, of course, that climate has told us that there's a limit to this growth. So we can't go beyond a certain level. So what do we do? The problem is, or possibly, as Kate Rayworth said, it might be even more severe than that. We have to downgrow or degrow. And the rate, she referred to a scientist called Kevin Anderson, who's saying that for the Western European world at least, degrowth in terms of reduced carbon dioxide per year needs to be between 10 and 15% per annum. So we need to reduce our fossil fuel consumption in particular with a lot. Sweden has been reasonably successful. I think we came up to 1.4% reduction this year compared to 2016. But we're still way off the 10 or 15% that are needed. So what can we do? There are other ways to use the money. One way that has been, sorry.
Yeah, so is there an assessment how much we would have to degrow in percents?
I can refer you to Kevin Anderson. He speaks on YouTube in a number of ways. Please have a look at him. One way that has been discussed in terms of investments in Sweden is to stop building houses with bricks or cement, but rather use wood instead, because that forms a carbon sink. Once it's in the house, it sits there for ages, up to 100 years perhaps. So that's one way to sort of capture carbon and put it away. But of course, if you have lots of money, you should invest it in, for example, sustainable energy or wind turbines or whatever. Yep. And in terms of consumption, we should buy less. We should keep stuff for longer, which means that we should buy better quality. In terms of transportation, we should buy local goods rather than goods from far away. We should eat less meat, obviously. All those hamburgers actually emit a lot of greenhouse gases, as you know. And maybe we should work less to reduce our consumption. So, my conclusions, quickly.
Let's go for one.
We're over-consuming because loans move consumption from the future to now, so which means we can consume much more than we really have. And too much money leads to faster extraction of natural resources, of course, and too much waste as well, like carbon dioxide. We need a longer-term perspective, and the reason here against the banking system of today is, of course, that banks, they don't look long-term. They want short-term payback. So we have a problem with investment, with borrowed money from banks. And we need to handle this possible degrowth without a crisis. And we think that that's easier to achieve without banks in the middle. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
I'm taking this opportunity as a token vegan in the monetary movement to point out that animal agriculture, in terms of the amount of protein per acre for plants, is 10 times greater than for meat. And according to the studies by the UN, there's more greenhouse gases produced by animal agriculture than the entire transportation sector. And World Watch did a study saying it's up to 51% of all greenhouse gases is attributable to animal agriculture. So it's just kind of
It's a
interesting
huge
tidbit.
part
Yeah.
of the problem.
Well, it's even worse on the methane side.
Yes.
Way
Well,
out of line.
they take that into account. That's part of the number.
Just going to say, in case you or anyone else wasn't aware, the paper that Positive Money brought out last week, calling a green, it's called A Green Bank of England, is really relevant to this topic. And there's one copy I brought over there, which is just for reference here, but it's online available. So
Yeah. And Kate Rayworth has worked together with yourselves.
yes, yes, the paper we brought out in January, Escaping Growth Dependency, Kate exposure on the panel, and that's over there as well.
Okay, last one.
Yeah, so I have a quick question. So if deforestation is the problem, where do we get the wood for building wooden houses?
Yeah, of course, but much of the discussion now is to use the forest for biofuel, which is of course burning coal again, even though it's not fossil. It's still putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's much better to use that wood for construction instead of biofuel.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean...
And plant new trees.
Yeah,
it doesn't help to cut down the trees
Yes,
to build
because-
buildings. You need to
yeah,
plant new trees.
Exactly, because you're just replacing the fuel with the houses, but it's still deforestation unless you plant new trees, then...
Yeah, of course, the best
Yeah.
thing is to
Yeah.
keep the forest there, obviously, but I mean, we need to build houses.
Yeah, of course.
I think if you just look at
Okay,
replacing
so-
like living forests with dead wood, but they're looking at replacing concrete and other things that might potentially be